In the world of high-stakes auctions, a photograph is usually valued by who is behind the camera, but sometimes the value lies in what is hidden in the frame. When authenticator Dr. John Thorne examined Lot 47, a dusty, forgotten image from 1899, he didn't just see a picture. He saw a murder weapon, he saw a ghost, and he saw the unraveling of one 25-year-old frontier conspiracy that began with a blood and ended with a silence.
Dr. John Thorne had spent 15 years separating authentic history from expensive forgeries. It was meticulous work, the kind that suited a man who understood how the past could haunt the present. Thorne rarely spoke of the brother he'd lost to an unsolved hit-and-run 20 years earlier, but colleagues noticed he took cold cases personally. When the estate of a Wyoming collector arrived at the Legends of the West auction house, it seemed routine. The deceased was Marcus Finch, great-grandson of a frontier photographer whose work had mostly been forgotten. Box after box of frontier debris, until Thorne found the photograph. Labeled simply, Hunters, 1899, it depicted three men hardened by the elements. But Thorne's job is to look past the faces. He zoomed in on the hardware. The man on the right held a Winchester rifle. To the naked eye, standard issue, but under extreme digital magnification, a chilling detail emerged. Etched into the stock was a silver inlay, the Ouroboros, a serpent consuming its own tail. This wasn't a catalog order. This was the bespoke signature of U.S. Marshal Everett Vance. Thorne's blood ran cold. He knew the history. That rifle was legally listed as stolen evidence from a crime scene, taken from Marshal Vance's cold, dead body in October 1899. If this photo was real, Thorne wasn't looking at three hunters. He was looking at the men who killed a U.S. Marshal. To understand the gravity of the find, we have to go back to the crime. October 15, 1899, Marshal Vance is transporting a prisoner through a remote pass in the Bighorn Mountains. 3 days later, a cavalry patrol finds them both executed, each with a single shot to the head. It was a professional hit. Vance's horse was unharmed, still tied to a tree. His badge, wallet, and that distinctive Winchester were gone. The prisoner, a member of the Red Creek Gang awaiting trial, was found face down beside him. At the time, authorities blamed the Red Creek Gang, a brutal outfit of outlaws responsible for a string of robberies and murders across the territory. The theory was simple. The gang had freed their own and killed the lawman who caught him. But despite a territory-wide manhunt, no member of the gang was ever apprehended. The case went cold. The killers became ghosts. Now, 125 years later, the murder weapon appears in a casual portrait. The implication was damning. The killers hadn't vanished. They had posed for a trophy shot. Thorne needed to identify these men, and to do that he needed the name of the photographer. A microscopic embossment in the corner gave up the secret, a raven. The mark of Albert Finch, the great-grandfather of the man whose estate had just arrived at auction. Locally, Finch was known as the Raven. Finch was an eccentric. He didn't just take photographs, he believed he was capturing souls. He was convinced that every image imprisoned a fragment of its subject's spirit. Because of this obsession, he kept manic, detailed logs of every shutter click. The date, the names, even the weather. Thorne accessed the Finch archives at the University of Wyoming, hunting for any entry from October 1899. He found it, October 18th, commissioned by the three friends, Silas, Jebediah, and Caleb Kane. Payment, $1 silver and a rabbit pelt. Thorne ran the names against census records and land deeds, and that's when the investigation took its darkest turn. Caleb Kane wasn't just a random gunman. He was Marshal Everett Vance's younger brother. Their mother had remarried after their father's death. Everett, the elder, took his stepfather's name, Vance, when he joined law enforcement to escape the family's rough reputation. Caleb kept the Kane name. The brothers hadn't spoken in years. Thorne dug through local newspaper archives and found what he was looking for, a bitter public feud. It was over an inheritance, their mother's ranch, split unevenly in her will. Everett, the lawman, had received the larger share. Caleb had contested it in court and lost. Just 5 days before the murder, the brothers had a screaming match in the town square of Casper. Witnesses described it as venomous. Caleb reportedly told Everett he'd see him in hell. Motive, greed and resentment. Weapon, the stolen Winchester. Evidence, the photograph. Thorne believed he had built a perfect case for fratricide, a brother killing a brother over land and legacy. Thorne prepared to present his findings to the auction house. The narrative was clean. Caleb Kane killed his estranged brother, stole the family rifle as a twisted memento, and posed for a photograph to commemorate his crime. Case closed. But Thorne was meticulous. Before submitting his report, he ran one final background check on the three men in the photograph. Caleb, Silas, and Jebediah Kane weren't outlaws. They were bounty hunters licensed by the territorial government. And according to the records, they were among the best in the West, credited with over 40 captures in 3 years. Efficient, relentless, brutal when necessary, and according to the court records, completely innocent of any involvement in the murder. On the exact day Marshall Vance was murdered in the Bighorn Mountains, Caleb and his crew were 300 miles away, handing over a notorious cattle rustler to the sheriff in Cheyenne. There were witnesses. There were signatures. There were timestamps from 3 separate officials. The alibi was ironclad. Caleb Kane could not have killed his brother. Thorne stared at the contradiction. Caleb had the motive. Caleb had the murder weapon in his hands 3 days after the killing. But Caleb physically could not have pulled the trigger. The timeline was broken. The narrative collapsed. Frustrated, Thorne stepped back from the photograph. If the Kanes didn't commit the murder, how did they end up with the rifle? He decided to map the trio's entire career. Every bounty, every court appearance, every payment, looking for patterns, for anomalies. And there, in the negative space of the data, he found something strange. For 3 years, the Kane crew had claimed a bounty every 2 weeks, like clockwork. They were machines. But starting October 16, 1899, the day news of the marshal's death would have reached Cheyenne by telegraph, their activity stopped completely. No bounties, no court appearances, no income of any kind. For 2 brutal winter months, the most prolific hunters in the West vanished from every record. They resurfaced only on December 20th, 3 days after the photograph with the rifle was taken. And buried in a regional newspaper from that same week, Thorne found a small article he'd previously overlooked. A cavalry patrol had discovered 3 bodies in an abandoned mining cabin, executed, each with a single shot to the head. No identification, no witnesses. The case was never solved. Why would 3 mercenaries stop working for 2 months in the middle of their most profitable season? Unless they were working for free. Unless they were hunting something that didn't have a price on its head. Thorne looked at the photo one last time, searching for anything he might have missed. And that's when he realized he had overlooked the most important witness of all. Tucked beside the men, barely visible against the dark logs of the cabin, was a dog, a bloodhound. Marshall Vance was famous throughout Wyoming for his dog, a bloodhound named Tracker. The animal was legendary, credited with locating over a dozen fugitives by scent alone. But Tracker was equally notorious for his fierce loyalty. Veterinary records from Casper noted that the dog had bitten 3 deputies who tried to handle him. He obeyed no one but Vance. After the murder, Tracker had disappeared from the crime scene. The cavalry patrol found no trace of him. He was presumed dead, killed by the gang, or lost to the wilderness. Yet here was Tracker, not cowering, not snarling, sitting peacefully at the feet of Caleb Kane, the brother Vance had publicly disowned. The realization struck Thorne with sudden clarity. He'd had the story backwards from the beginning. This wasn't a trophy photo of murderers celebrating their kill. It was a receipt. Proof of justice delivered outside the law. The theory, now supported by the archival evidence and accepted by historians at the Wyoming State Museum, tells a different story than anyone expected. When Caleb Kane learned that his brother had been murdered, the feud died with him. Whatever bitterness had poisoned their relationship, whatever words had been spoken in anger, none of it mattered anymore. Everett was blood, and blood demanded an answer. The Kane brothers, Caleb, Silas, and Jebediah, dropped their paying contracts. They went off book. For 2 months they tracked the Red Creek gang through the frozen wilderness, following a trail that official law enforcement had abandoned. They weren't working for the courts. They weren't working for money. They were working for blood. When they found the gang, there was no arrest, no trial. 3 bullets, 3 bodies, justice, frontier style. The Kanes recovered the family rifle, the Winchester that had been stolen from Everett's body. And they found something else. Tracker, half-starved but alive, chained outside the cabin. The gang had kept him, perhaps as a trophy, perhaps intending to sell him. Tracker accepted them because he knew who they were. He could smell the family resemblance. The same blood ran through their veins. To Tracker, Caleb wasn't a stranger. He was an extension of his master. He was family. 3 days later, they commissioned the Raven to take their portrait. Perhaps as proof. Perhaps as closure. Perhaps in their own way, they believed they were capturing their brother's soul one final time, giving him a place in the image alongside the justice he deserved.
Dr. Thorne rewrote the auction catalog that night. The house wasn't selling a photograph of outlaws. They were set in a documented saga of frontier redemption, a story of guilt, grief, and revenge written in silver and silence. Lot 47 sold for $847,000 to the Museum of Western Justice in Cody, Wyoming. It now hangs in their permanent collection, beside the rifle itself, which was separately authenticated and acquired from a private collector who had unknowingly purchased it decades early. We often look at history as a series of dates and dry facts, names in ledgers, headline in newspaper, but sometimes the truth is hidden in the space between records. In this scratch on a rifle stuck in the silence of a winter that produced no paperwork, in the calm eyes of a dog who knew something the documents didn't. Caleb Kane never reconciled with his brother while Everett was alive. The angry words they exchanged in that town square were the last they ever spoke, but in the frozen silence of Wyoming winter, tracking killers through snow had buried all trails. Caleb found another way to say what he never could. He made sure his brother could finally rest. Every family carries unfinished business, words unspoken, debt unpaid, justice delayed. But sometimes the record finds a way to speak for itself. If you have a mystery hiding in your archives, share it in the comments. And for more stories pulled from the silence of history, subscribe and turn the notifications.